There's a 52-year-old guy somewhere in Ohio right now. He makes $94,000 a year. He drives a 2017 Toyota Camry with 130,000 miles on it because, in his words, it still runs. He has a $400 set of golf clubs in the garage he's used twice. He has $9,800 in credit card debt he's been carrying for 3 years. He also maxes out his 401k every year, without fail. He doesn't trust the stock market, but he's in it. He doesn't trust his employer, but he's been there 11 years. He's paying his mom's prescription copays and his daughter's car insurance. Ask him how he's doing financially. He'll squint and say, fine, in a way that does not mean fine. That guy is the entire Gen X economy in human form. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about why generations behave so differently with money. If you've ever looked at the Gen Xer in your life and thought, why are they like this? Hit subscribe, because we're about to unpack one of the strangest financial psychologies in modern American history. Now, before we get into the math, let me explain why Gen X is genuinely, structurally, measurably different from every other living generation when it comes to money. Because this isn't a personality quirk. This isn't a vibe. This is what happens when you take a group of human beings, drop them into the worst possible economic conditions at the worst possible ages, and then ask them to fund their own retirement using a system that was invented as a tax loophole. There are roughly 65 million Gen Xers in America today, born between 1965 and 1980, currently aged 46 to 61. That's almost exactly the same population as the boomers, and yet boomers control about 51% of all household wealth in the United States, while Gen X controls 26%. Same population, half the wealth, $83 trillion versus $42 trillion. If wealth were distributed by population size, Gen X would have an extra $20 trillion sitting in their accounts. They don't. That missing $20 trillion is not in their 401ks, it is not in their home equity, it is not in their savings accounts. It is somewhere else, owned by someone else, and we're going to spend the next 18 minutes figuring out where it went. Let me start with the childhoods, because everything traces back here. Gen X was the first generation in modern American history to be raised on a mass scale, without parents around. The US divorce rate doubled between 1960 and 1980. Married couples with children dropped from 40% of households in 1970 to 25% by 1990. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, but the cultural infrastructure to support working parents didn't exist yet. Daycare wasn't normalized. After-school programs were rare, so the kids came home from school, let themselves into an empty house with a key on a string around their neck, made themselves a snack, watched MTV, and figured it out. According to a widely cited 2004 study, around 40% of Gen Xers were latchkey kids. 40% of an entire generation raised themselves between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. Monday through Friday for most of their childhoods. And here's why that matters financially. When you're 7 and your parents aren't there to fix things, you learn to fix things. When you're 10 and the toilet's overflowing, you don't call anyone because no one is coming. You grab a plunger. That's not a parenting failure, by the way. A lot of Gen X parents were doing the best they could in a culture that hadn't caught up to dual income households. But what it produced was a generation that, by adulthood, had internalized one specific lesson. The system isn't going to help you, the adults aren't paying attention, so you'd better figure it out yourself. That single belief is the foundation of every weird financial habit Gen X has. It's the latchkey kid grown up, still convinced no one's coming to rescue them because, historically speaking, no one ever did. Okay, so the childhood programmed the operating system. Now let me tell you a story, because the rest of this video is going to make a lot more sense if you can see it through one person's life. So picture a Gen Xer, call him Edward. Edward was born in 1968. His parents got divorced when he was 11, which was a pretty normal age to have that happen back then. He graduated high school in 1986, did 2 years of community college because his parents said a 4-year degree was a luxury they couldn't afford, and started his first real job in 1988 at a regional bank making $19,000. They handed him a benefits packet and said sign up for this thing called a 401k, and Edward, who had no idea what a 401k was, signed up. He put in 3% because that's what the HR lady recommended. By 1995, Edward was 27, making $34,000 with $11,000 in his 401k. He felt rich. He bought 1 share of Microsoft. By 1999, he had $87,000 because the dot-com run was inflating everything. He bought a small townhouse in 2000 for $148,000. He felt like he was on his way. Then the dot-com bubble popped. His 401k dropped from $87,000 to $44,000 in 18 months. Cut in half. He kept working, he kept contributing. By 2006, he had clawed his way back to $156,000. He upgraded to a real house in 2006 for $312,000 with a payment that ate almost a third of his take-home pay. His son was born in 2004 and his daughter in 2007. He felt, again, like he was finally getting somewhere. Then 2008 happened. The house he bought for $312,000 was worth $214,000 by 2010. His 401k dropped from $156,000 to $79,000. He was underwater, but he kept paying the mortgage because that's what Edward does. He kept funding the 401k because that's also what Edward does. He just absorbed the loss and kept going. By 2019, his dad had a stroke, and Edward started covering the gap on the assisted living facility. By 2020, COVID hit, and his oldest needed help with online college. By 2023, his mom needed memory care, which his sister couldn't afford, so Edward covered it. By 2026, Edward is 58. His 401k has $310,000 in it. His house is worth $480,000 with $190,000 left on the mortgage. He has $11,000 in credit card debt that he can't seem to pay off because something always comes up. He needs about $1.4 million to retire comfortably. He has, generously, 7 years to get there. The math, as Edward well knows, does not work. That story is not unusual. That story is the median Gen X experience compressed into one human life. And now you understand why the data looks the way it does. There is actual academic backing for what happened to Edward's brain along the way. Two economists, Ulrike Malmendier and Stefan Nagel, published a study in 2011 called Depression Babies: Do Macroeconomic Experiences Affect Risk-Taking? And what they found was, in plain English, this. If you live through a market crash, your brain treats the stock market as fundamentally dangerous for the rest of your life. Not for a year, not for a decade, for the rest of your life. You become less likely to invest, you invest less when you do, and you're more pessimistic about future returns even decades after the crash is over, even when the market has recovered and tripled. The trauma is permanent. Now apply that to Gen X who lived through 1987, 2000, and 2008, all during their formative financial years. The Alliance Retirement Income Institute estimates Gen X has lived through 8 recessions in their lifetimes. The cumulative effect, neurologically, is a generation that is simultaneously the most cynical and the most disciplined. They don't trust the system, but they participate in it. They think it's rigged, but they max out their 401k anyway. They are, in a word, contradictions wearing reading glasses. And speaking of contradictions, let me show you the single weirdest thing about Gen X money behavior, because this number broke my brain when I first saw it. According to Fidelity's 2025 data, Gen X has the highest 401k savings rate of any generation in America, at 15.4% of their income, the only generation above the recommended 15% threshold. By this measure, they are the most disciplined savers in the country, but also according to Experian's 2025 Consumer Debt Study, Gen X carries the highest average credit card balance of any generation, at $9,600. Boomers carry $6,795. Millennials carry $6,961. Gen X carries 40% more credit card debt than either generation surrounding them. So how do you become both the most disciplined saver and the most indebted credit card user simultaneously? The answer is the sandwich. And no, I'm not talking about lunch. Gen X is the first generation in American history to be financially supporting their aging parents and their adult children at the same time, on an industrial scale. Pew Research did a study in 2022 that found 54% of Americans in their 40s have a living parent who's 65 or older, and are either raising a minor child or financially supporting an adult child. 54%, more than half of an entire age cohort. Stop and let that number sit. Think about what that means in a single household. It means dinner is interrupted by a phone call from the assisted living facility about a billing dispute. It means a Saturday morning is spent driving 40 minutes to your mom's house to fix a smoke detector, then 40 minutes back to drive your kid to a soccer tournament. A 2025 Finance of America survey of sandwich generation caregivers found 69% are financially exhausted, 80% physically exhausted, and 86% emotionally exhausted. AARP data says the average family caregiver spends around $7,000 a year out of pocket, and If you have to take time off work, that frequently exceeds $10,000. So picture Edward again. He's maxing out his 401k because he's disciplined and terrified of being poor when he's old, but he's also writing a $400 check to a memory care facility for his mom. And he's covering his daughter's car insurance because she's still finding her feet. And his furnace went out last month and the repair was $2,300, so that went on the Visa because his liquid cash was already deployed against the 401k, the mom, the kid, and the mortgage. The credit card isn't a personality flaw, it's a math problem. It's what happens when you ask one paycheck to do the job of three, and here's where it gets unhinged. According to a 2025 Schroeder study, 24% of Gen Xers who participate in a workplace retirement plan have borrowed money from that plan. Not boomers, who do it 21% of the time, not millennials, who do it 17% of the time, Gen X. The most disciplined savers in America are also the most likely to raid their own future to pay for their present. The top reasons they gave? Family emergencies, paying down credit card debt, and managing the cost of living. They're not borrowing to buy boats, they're borrowing to keep the household functioning. They saved the money, they knew not to touch it, they touched it anyway, because they ran out of options. If you are Gen X and watching this, you might already be doing the mental math on whether you've taken a 401k loan in the last 5 years. A quarter of you have. Now, let me show you the structural decision that screwed Gen X harder than any single recession ever did. Because this is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. There's a thing the financial industry talks about called the three-legged stool of retirement. Leg 1 is your pension, leg 2 is Social Security, and leg 3 is your personal savings. For most of the 20th century, this is how retirement worked for the American middle class. You'd work somewhere for 30 years, they'd give you a pension, Social Security would supplement it, and you'd have a little savings on top. That was the deal. And then, somewhere around 1980, the deal changed, and nobody told anybody. Here's what happened. In 1978, Congress passed a tax code provision called Section 401k. It was originally meant as a small supplemental benefit for executives, basically a tax-advantaged way to defer a portion of bonus compensation. A benefits consultant named Ted Benna realized in 1981 that you could use this provision to build a whole employer-sponsored retirement plan, where the employee saves their own money and the employer maybe matches a portion. And then a very specific thing happened in conference rooms across corporate America. A group of executives in suits in those wood-paneled boardrooms you see in old corporate documentaries looked at this provision and saw a way to dump pension liability off their balance sheets and onto their workers. These were not faceless market forces. These were specific people making a specific decision in specific meetings between roughly 1982 and 1995. They said, we could just stop giving people pensions and have them save their own money instead. That would save us billions. Sign us up. Over the next 25 years, the American pension system was quietly dismantled and replaced with the 401k. In 1980, 38% of private sector workers had a defined benefit pension. Today, that number is around 15%. Among Gen X specifically, only 14% have a pension. For boomers, it's 56%. Same country, same workforce, born 15 years apart. 4 times the pension coverage for the older group. What that means in a real human life is this. Edward's dad worked at the steel plant for 32 years and retired in 2003 with a pension that paid him $2,400 a month guaranteed for the rest of his life. Edward has worked at the bank for 37 years and will retire with a 401k balance he has to manage, withdraw from carefully, and not outlive. His dad got a paycheck for life. Edward gets a balance sheet. And Ted Benna, the guy who invented the 401k, told CBS News in 2011 that his creation had become a monster. His exact words, "The man who built the system that replaced pensions said it should be blown up." Not exactly a ringing endorsement, and this is the thing Gen X intuitively feels but has a hard time articulating. The rules changed mid-game. They walked into the workforce in the mid-1980s under one set of rules, and by the time they were 40, those rules had been replaced by a completely different game. They were told, fund your own retirement, manage your own investments, switch jobs when you need to, and the system will work for you. And what most of them are now realizing as they cross into their 60s is that the system mostly worked for the people designing it. I want you to do something right now. Pull up your retirement account or your parents' retirement balance if you know it, or estimate where you think a typical 55-year-old's balance should be. Look at the number. Now, imagine living on that money for 25 years. That's the exercise Gen X is doing every night before bed. Here's what the actual data says. The typical Gen X household has about $40,000 saved for retirement, according to the National Institute on Retirement Security. $40,000 for a household that's on average 9 to 14 years away from retiring. That's not a retirement plan, that's a long weekend. The median Gen X 401k balance per Fidelity is around $67,100, and in 2025, Northwestern Mutual found that 54% of Gen Xers don't believe they'll be financially ready for retirement. 48% expect to keep working through retirement, mostly out of necessity. Now here's the part I want to flag for you before we get to the end, because we're about to land somewhere that genuinely surprised me when I first ran the numbers. Gen X is not one group financially. They are two groups occupying the same generation, and the gap between those two groups is the largest within-generation wealth gap in modern American history. Hold on to that thought, because the data point that proves it is coming in about 3 minutes, and it's going to reframe everything we've talked about so far. But first, housing. Because if I had to pick the single financial decision that most defines Gen X, it's the home they bought. A huge portion of Gen X bought their first home between 2003 and 2008, the largest housing bubble in American history, peaking right before the largest housing crash in American history. Gen X bought at the top. They watched their home values fall 30, 40, 50% in some markets. A lot of them ended up underwater for years, and the ones who held on are the reason 72.7% of Gen X owns their home today. They couldn't sell, so they stayed. And then a strange thing happened. They refinanced in 2020 when rates dropped to 3%, and now they're sitting on homes they bought in 2007 with a 3% mortgage in a market where the same house costs 3 times as much and rates are at 7. They are not moving. Ever. Gen X is staying put because moving would mean trading a $1,400 monthly payment for a $3,400 monthly payment, and the math, as it tends to do in Gen X life, simply does not work. Now let's land that bimodal claim I made a minute ago. According to Northwestern Mutual's 2025 data, only 33% of Gen Xers work with a financial advisor. For boomers, it's 43%. Gen X is the least advised working generation in America, and it's not because they can't afford it, it's because they don't trust the people selling the advice. They watched their parents get burned, they watched the entire financial industry produce 2008, they watched roughly 60% of professional fund managers fail to beat the index every year. So they Google, they read Reddit threads, they build their own financial plans from 1,000 pieces of internet taped together at midnight after the kids go to bed. And for a surprising number of them, it works. Fidelity reported that 60% of all 401k millionaires in their system are Gen Xers. 60%. From the same generation where the median balance is 67 grand. Stop and think about what that means. 60% of the millionaires, median balance of 67,000. Those numbers cannot both be true unless you're looking at two completely different populations inside one generation. And that's exactly what's happening. There's a Gen Xer who saw the writing on the wall in 1995, started saving aggressively, didn't trust anyone, and built their own escape hatch. They have $1.2 million in their 401k. They paid off the house. They're going to be fine. And then there's a Gen Xer right next door who did everything they were told. Bought the house, funded the 401k, sent the kids to college, took care of mom, and ran out of margin around 2018. They have $58,000. They are not going to be fine. The difference between them isn't income, it's not luck, it's not inheritance, it's whether the trauma of the latchkey childhood produced a hyper controller or a quiet conformist. If you are Gen X and watching this, you already know which one you are. You knew by minute 4. So when you see your Gen X parent driving the same Toyota Camry for 15 years while their friends lease BMWs, that's not cheapness. That's a person who watched their mom get laid off in 1986 and never trusted a paycheck again. When you see your Gen X boss refuse to take a vacation even though they have 4 weeks of PTO saved up, that's not workaholism. That's a person who watched the dot-com bust eat their first job and decided to never assume the next one is safe. Like when you see your Gen X aunt obsessively check her 401k balance the day after a market drop, that's not paranoia, that's behavioral economics. That's a person whose brain was permanently rewired by 2008, doing exactly what the science says she's going to do for the rest of her life. Gen X is not weird about money. Gen X is the exact predictable output of being dropped into an economic blender for 40 straight years and asked to come out smiling. The fact that they're standing at all is honestly kind of incredible. If this video helped explain why the Gen Xer in your life acts the way they do about money, do me one favor, send it to them. Send it to your Gen X parent, your Gen X boss, your Gen X older sibling, the friend who's been quietly carrying everything for 15 years. Because the one thing Gen X has never gotten is the acknowledgement that the rules genuinely did change mid-game, and that the version of them driving the same Camry for 15 years isn't a personality flaw, it's a survival response. And smash that like button and subscribe for more content that breaks down why generations think about money so differently. After everything Gen X has been through, the least we can do is stop assuming they're being dramatic. They're not. They're just doing the math